Welcome to all of you on both sides of the Atlantic who are joining us today for this panel discussion entitled Between Russia First and Security First, Ukraine and Changing EU and NATO Priorities. This is the second in a series of discussions that the Ukrainian Free University has planned for this Jubilee year when the university is celebrating its 100th anniversary. And these discussions are dedicated to the topic of current Ukrainian affairs and particularly EU-Ukraine relations. Today's session was organized in cooperation with the journal Brussels Ukraina Review, and I am expressing special thanks to Dr. Marta Barandi, the editor of this journal, and also a member of our teaching staff for the wonderful cooperation. We have a very distinguished group of panelists today joining us for this discussion, and I will introduce them in alphabetical order. Viola von Cramon is member of the European Parliament and serves on the Committee on Foreign Relations. She is a member of the delegation to the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Association Committee. In 2020, she joined the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation, and she is a member of the Democracy Support and Election Coordination Group, excuse me, which oversees the Parliament's election observation missions. Previously, Mrs. von Cramon was a member of the German Bundestag and deputy chairwoman of the German-Ukrainian Parliamentary Friendship Group. Daniel Fried is an American diplomat whose career in the US State Department spanned 40 years, during which he served as US coordinator for sanctions policy during the Obama and Trump administrations, and helped lead the West's response to Russian military intervention in Ukraine. He also served as Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and as Senior Director for European and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council. And he was US Ambassador to Poland. Ambassador Fried is known for being active in designing and implementing US policy to advance freedom and security in Central and Eastern Europe, NATO enlargement, and the Russian-NATO relationship. Currently, Ambassador Fried is a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council. Andrius Kubilius is member of the European Parliament and former Prime Minister of Lithuania. He currently serves on the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the Committee on Industry, Research, and Energy. He is also the chair of the delegation to the Euronest Parliamentary Assembly, a member of the delegation to the EU-Ukraine Parliamentary Association Committee, and a substitute member of the delegation to the EU-Russian Cooperation Committee. He is the author of such international initiatives as the Marshall Plan for Ukraine, which was later known as the European Plan for Ukraine, the Trio Strategy for the Future of the European Partnership, and also the Western Strategy towards Russia. And our fourth speaker is Vitold Vasccikovsky, member of the European Parliament and chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and member of the Subcommittee on Security and Defense. He is also a member of the delegation to the Euronest Parliamentary Assembly. His diplomatic career includes service as Poland's liaison officer to NATO in Brussels, after which he became Deputy Parliament Representative of Poland to the newly created diplomatic mission to the North Atlantic Alliance. In 2002, he was named Poland's ambassador to Iran, and in 2015, he was Poland's Minister of Foreign Affairs. Our moderator today is Adrian Karatnitsky, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council and Director of its Ukraine-North America Dialogue. For 10 years, he served as president and CEO of Freedom House, a major pro-democracy and economic reform NGO. For 12 years, he directed the benchmark survey, Freedom in the World. Mr. Karatnitsky served as co-director of the US Council on Foreign Relations Task Force on the US and United Nations, and as a member of the United Nations Blue Ribbon Commission on Ukraine. He is co-author and editor of over 20 Books focus on post-communist space and global trends in reform. And many of you will know him as a frequent contributor to Foreign Affairs, Washington Post, Newsweek, the Wall Street Journal, and Financial Times. I thank all the participants and the moderator for accepting our invitation today to participate in this discussion, and I turn over the floor to our moderator.
Thank you. A great pleasure and a great honor to be in the company of so many friends of Ukraine. I mean, trusted and proven friends of Ukraine in our four speakers. I suppose that one of the anomalies of our discussion is that we frame the issue as between Russia first and security first, as a sort of a set of discussions that I think every European has to talk about. Some Europeans will argue that Russia first is a path to security first. In other words, accommodating Russia and finding common ground is the better path of security. Others will say that resilience, strength, the use of sanctions and the fight against corruption and so on is the better path towards security. But the most important thing is that Ukraine is only peripheral to this, but it is not, as we well know. I recall in 1999, I visited someone known to all our speakers, Boris Tarasyuk, a two-time Ukrainian foreign minister and now still a Ukrainian representative in the Council of Europe, an MP, a very distinguished statesman. And as foreign minister, as we walked out of the foreign ministry, he pointed up and said, "You think this is the foreign ministry, but 60% of the time that is spent here is spent on Russia." This was still in 1999, before full-blown. And I think that it's also the case that Ukrainian diplomacy in other countries, not only in international institutions, is hugely focused on the threat and on the problems that Russia causes. So it is absolutely correct to discuss Russia as a central issue in Ukraine's survival, evolution, and so on. And I think we will frame the issue primarily looking at Ukraine's resilience, with Russia always in mind. Appropriately enough, because two of our speakers, Minister Waszczykowski and former Prime Minister Kubilius, were introduced a resolution a little over a week ago that the European Parliament passed by, I believe, something like a 569 to 67 overwhelming majority, with extremely strong proposals of steps that Europe should take in the event of an accelerated Russian aggression, serious steps that should be taken in response to the mass repressions that are now going on, both linked to Navalny and going well beyond it. And so I think that it's probably a good place to begin to measure the temperature, not just of the European Parliament, but also of the European publics and of, I would say, European business, and most importantly, of European governments, not simply their parliamentary representatives, with our distinguished speakers. And I will ask Dan, as part of this, Daniel Fried, as part of this discussion, more to comment as an outsider who interacts with Europe, and we will not focus so much on US policy, except in the synchronization of US policy. But perhaps if we could start with Madame von Cramon, with her thoughts about where things stand. But before we go, before we turn to our speakers, I'll ask those of our speakers who are not speaking to mute themselves until such time as they are joined into the conversation. And the other point that I want to make is that we don't simply have three parliamentarians. We have parliamentarians in the presence of Mr. Kubilius and Dr. Waszczykowski, perhaps who are representatives of governing parties. And we have, if you read the latest polls in Germany, we have a representative of the party that perhaps in September may be the leading party in Germany, in our first interlocutor, Madame von Cramon. I would ask you, with permission, to maybe to get a dialogue going, that we each maybe talk, all of you speak for maybe 2 or 3 minutes to kind of sort of begin the first question of where does Europe stand now in its assessment and of the Russian threat and of how to cope with it.
Thank you very, very much, Adrian, and also Maria and all the others who have provided and who have facilitated this great event here this afternoon, at least in Central Europe, it's afternoon. Well, where does Europe stand when it comes to Russia? I think that now almost everyone woke up and is aware of the facts which lie around and which are so obvious when it comes to Russia. The last attempts of the so-called maneuver along the Ukrainian borders had not just threatened Ukraine. I think there was a kind of a nervousness, there was a kind of uncertainty how to deal with this all over Europe. And I've talked to many people in my home country, in Germany, but also, of course, in the parliament, in many think tanks. And there was obviously the will of the Putin regime, again, to test the ground. How far can we go with the Biden administration? What does it mean? Will they really provide security for Ukraine? If we go further, how can we deal with this? With the Crimea annexation, if we really need some more water, and so all these little bits and pieces, I think that they try to test. But what they have achieved, I mean, you have mentioned the resolution, and I think it was easier that time to get a majority on this, to get much tougher rhetorics on this. I think the commitment in the European Parliament for Ukraine's security, but also then for the EU security was much more and was much easier to achieve. Nevertheless, when it comes to the hard facts, would we be able and willing to provide Ukraine with weapons? Would we deliver weapons? Would there be any more than the task force in the Baltic? I'm not so sure. I'm pretty much, let's say, aware that at least the Green Party, and you were referring to maybe that someone from the Green Party will also be part of the government. I don't want to go too far, so let's wait and see what the results of the federal election will be. But nevertheless, it looks like that we might be a part of the next and the future coalition. We Greens are always and were always very not just committed, but engaged in terms of Eastern Partnership, in terms of our direct neighborhood, but also in terms of rhetorics and sanctions and actions when it regarded Russia. We were the only ones, the only party all over Germany from the very beginning opposing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We are the only ones who were very outspoken when it came to human rights violations, independent media, and so on. But also when it came to the Ukraine Maidan events, the revolution of dignity. I think it was mainly the Greens who asked for support and assistance and really a broader package of solidarity from Germany, but also from the European Union. So in that respect, I think the Greens had always delivered, were always reliable. And our candidate Annalena Baerbock has recently given a very interesting interview, very impressive, where she was speaking about more toughness and dialogue. And she was mainly received support through all the society, which is also important to see. It's not just the Greens, but many people, at least in Germany now, share the perspective that we need a tougher handling on Russia.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I ask Prime Minister Kubilius to next take the floor and maybe to talk about, again, this moment, your role in the resolution. There was another interesting phenomenon in the resolution, and that was that the Lega in Italy, which is considered to be friendly to Putin, and certainly its leader has shown a great deal of sympathy, wearing Putin t-shirts and so on. What happened? Were there some surprises about how broad the support for such a strong resolution was, and does it signal also any changes you would think in the bigger capitals, meaning not just in the parliamentarian votes as a resolution, but when it becomes more binding as a matter of policy? Are we moving from a kind of an environment that Madame von Cramon has presented in terms of understanding to action? How do you assess that?
Well, thanks a lot, really, Adrian and Maria. And well, first of all, really, it's quite difficult to add anything to what Viola have said, since really, we see, that the recent actions of Putin, of Kremlin, are really opening eyes to many, capitals and in the parliament. Perhaps there is nothing new. Usually on resolutions during the last years on Navalny, on his poisoning, on his arrest, which we had before, were also supported by a huge majority. I don't know about Italians, from Lega, was not following so closely, but numbers were always quite big. Of course, as you know, foreign policy and security policy inside of EU, is quite complicated in its, establishment. Parliament makes good and strong, statements, but foreign policy is in the hands of member states, of the capital. So not always, things are moving the same line as we are, speaking in the parliament. But really, we see also forthcoming, perhaps changes even in Berlin, which are promising, that toughness can come, into EU policy towards Russia. There are a lot of discussions how we can, revise that policy. We are preparing some new report on that in the parliament, and here are really interesting articles. Experts, I would. I was really quite surprised by a recent article from European Council on Foreign Relations by Carl Bildt and his team, Popescu and others, where really exactly the same line was spoken out, that till now EU was too much trying to accommodate, to keep this Russia first or Putin first, policy. And there is really a need for revision into much more tough language and tough policy. So really, question is where Putin is heading. It's not easy to answer what he will try to do next, what is his goals and what are his aims. But perhaps what we need to see in a very clear light, that to have any hopes that we can agree with Putin on any security issues, at least from my point of view, are quite naive. So I would very easily suggest to change title of this nice conversation from it's very good from Russia first to security first, but security first. I can suggest, that it would be good to speak about democracy in Russia first. Again, maybe for somebody it can look like a naive hope that democracy can come into Russia, but democracy is an answer to a lot of problems which we see now in our relations with Russia. Democracies usually are not fighting, with each other, and so on and so on. So that is why, to try to see what are our possibilities to assist Russian people, Russian opposition, Russian protesters in really, in their wish to have democracy in Russia. That is one of the goals which we need to have in mind. On when we are talking about EU policy or Western policy, towards security first, agenda, I would say that we need to have perhaps in mind really to have some kind of holistic approach. We need to have really in our understanding very clear picture of Russia, where Russia is moving, how things are changing in Russia. Second, how what is going on in Ukraine. Ukrainian success can be very important really in influencing even developments in Russia itself. It can be an inspiration for Russian people to follow this good democratic example. And the success of Ukraine very much will depend on what will be EU policy towards Ukraine, towards integration of Ukraine. And I think that we need really to ask ourselves very simple questions: how we can make EU doors more open, if not totally open for integration of Ukraine, at least to make it more open. Because the answer to the question, both on how to assist Ukrainian successful development of its success and how to bring more security, comes through the doors of integration. And we can talk in both economical integration. There are again proposals on that EU can bring some kind of security compacts for associated countries like Ukraine and so on. So those are issues which we need to have in mind, and we need to see those the whole picture, holistic picture: Russia, Ukraine, Western community, including EU. That would be my answer to this, to the question how to move from Russia first to security first.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Minister Waszczykowski and maybe move the question. He represents a government as does represents a country as does Prime Minister Kubilius, that is very strong on more active support for Ukraine, that does not shy away from the idea that Ukraine should be given some resources for its kinetic military capabilities and so forth. And I want to just sort of maybe start from that dimension. I think there is, broadly speaking, there is support for sanctions, certainly among your colleagues, but the question and the idea of helping Ukraine if Ukraine is not to be a member of NATO, is there some way of building broader consensus that Ukraine can be given additional support in the way that, say, the United States is giving to build up its military potential, possibly in cooperation with NATO member countries? So how realistic do you think this is the sort of the center of gravity tilting towards a greater understanding of the threat that Russia poses? And maybe to even complicate your answer, what do you think is Putin's final intention vis-a-vis Ukraine?
Yes, thank you. Greetings from Warsaw. Can you see me? Can you hear me? So can continue. Thank you very much for inviting me. Let me start first describing a little bit the situation in Europe. I think that Europe, especially Western Europe, is a little bit confused about the situation. We had a week ago a discussion with Joseph Borrell on how to react, how to respond to the last escalation of military force by Russia, and there is no reaction from the West. Actually, Mr. Zelensky request to visit Berlin, I mean, part of the Normandy formula, was rejected by Angela Merkel. He went to Paris, but he came back from Paris empty-handed. Ursula von der Leyen openly rejected his appeal to visit Kyiv. And President Biden offered direct talks to Putin, to solve the Ukrainian question. So actually, he offered Putin what he expects for years: a direct talk to the United States, a kind of a Cold War style reaction to decide about Ukraine above the Ukraine heads. So the European Union is confused. They don't want to solve the problem. They want to pacify the problem. They want to freeze the problem just to come back to for appeasement policy, to the business as usual with Russia, because there is a myth that they can make huge deals trading directly with Russia. So let me remind you that the trade between Germany and Poland is much bigger than the trade between Germany and Russia. But of course, there is a myth in Western capitals that there is a kind of a bonanza in Russia, and we're supposed to care about Russia first. About Putin, I think I disagree with those who think that he is unpredictable. He is very much predictable. Let me remind you that a few years ago, he mentioned that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest tragedy in the history of Russia. So his plan maximum, plan A, is to come back to the position of the Soviet Union vis-a-vis the United States, and to rule, just like in the 70s and 80s, the world by this dyad, by these summits of US-Russia summits. It's impossible, of course, although recently Biden offered him this kind of a summit. So his plan B is to create some kind of 19th century concept of powers, just to rule the world with a few countries, few powers. Ведущие страны, we can say. He is not very comfortable to be confronted by the institutions, by the European Union, 27 of us, or by NATO. He just wants to pick a few countries from these institutions and deal with them directly, and to rule the problems. So he is predictable, and of course, whenever he has a chance to do us any harm, he is going to do this. How we can respond? Of course, there is no deficit of instrument in the West to stop Russian aggression. And we openly discussed this in the European Parliament, but of course we don't have executive power to implement all these appeals about getting him rid of from sweet financial operation, to stop buying gas from Russia, stop constructing the Nord Stream second gas pipe, and things like that. We can impose a price tag also on part of the Russian society, on oligarchs, celebrities, those who support Putin and those who benefit from the policy of aggressive policy. Why we still deal with these oligarchs? Why we keep the properties in Spain, Cyprus, and other countries? Why we keep inviting Russian celebrities or sports people to play with us at the same time the other Russian colleagues are shooting in Donbass? Why the laboratories in Harvard, Oxford are still open for the Russian scientists? You know, they benefit from our openness, and of course they still support Putin. So once we get rid of this opportunity for them, they start to think, is it still beneficial to support Putin aggressive policy? About Ukraine, well, there are a number of things we can help them. Of course, we cannot help them to win the war with Russia. It's impossible. At least we can help them to stop further escalation of aggression by selling them and giving them defensive weapons, anti-tank, anti-missile, anti-aircraft weapons to stop further Russian aggression. The second, we can help them to progress in the process of reforms. Then we can open different kind of a paths and channels of cooperation with the European Union. There are a number of things we can open, invite them, different kind of agencies like Frontex, for instance. Ukrainians can be part of this. In our part of Europe, we developed recently something which is called 3Cs Initiative, which is about energy, security, and communication and transport. Let's Ukrainian to join these two areas of cooperation, be part, at least informally, part of European Union programs, at least in this section of our cooperation. We can think also about the new format to replace Normandy formula and Minsk peace process, because after 7 years, how many years we can wait longer for the results, how to solve this conflict. So we can invite openly United States, UK to this format. United States and UK, there's a part of the Budapest memorandum from 1994. So they're supposed to be responsible for the peaceful solution of the conflict with Russia. I think that in this new formula, we're supposed to invite some neighbors of Ukraine, like Baltic countries, Poland, Romania, possibly Turkey, because all these countries are affected by this conflict and by an escalation. We are, as Poland, we are in a very unique situation because we are the neighbor of aggressor and the neighbor of victim of aggression. So we are very much responsible for providing information to the West about what's going on in our part of Europe and what's going on the Russian-Ukrainian front. So as you can see, let me finish this. There is no deficit of instrument how to deal with Russia. There is no deficit of instrument proposal how to solve the conflict, Russian-Ukrainian conflict. There is a lack of will, lack of determination. We have not too many statesmen in the Western capitals. We have too many politicians just want to make a geschäft, tomorrow's geschäft with Russia, win the next day election, and forget about the problems which are outside of European Union. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And also thank you for invoking the United States, which is a wonderful transition to our next speaker, Ambassador Daniel Free. I'd like him to maybe take a look at maybe offer us his perspectives on what he thinks is cooking in Europe on Russo-European relations and Ukraine in that sort of triangle, and secondly, what the Biden administration intends and what the Biden administration's entry into the shaping of Euro-Atlantic relations means for closer cooperation and the advancement of policies that are in the interests of Europe's security, but also of Ukraine's security as an integral part of Europe. So Dan, if you would maybe take a few minutes to offer us your wisdom on that.
Thank you, Adrian, and Vitold Vasccikovsky. It's great to be speaking to you all. I witam serdecznie Minister Waszczykowski, an old colleague. Today's a good day for this discussion, particularly of American perspectives, because the US Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is today in Kyiv. I think that is important. I think the Biden administration, whatever the past 4 years have meant in terms of US-Ukrainian relations, and it has been a difficult time, the Biden administration is looking at Ukraine clearly and well, and is looking at Russia, I think, clearly and well. I'll get to that. But first, on Europe, I understand the concerns that Ukrainians have about the mixed signals coming from Europe. Minister Waszczykowski described the more cynical and less sustainable strain of European opinion, something like, we have to get along with Russia, so let's just do business, and let's not let pesky countries like Ukraine or the Baltic states or Poland get in the way. That is a crude, but not, I fear, inaccurate summary of one strain of European opinion. But it is not the dominant strain, and it is not a growing strain. As I see it from this side of the Atlantic, Putin has managed to alienate Europe in general, the European Union in particular. He has, Viola von Cramon knows this far better than I do, but I suspect he has moved the needle on German opinion in an unfavorable direction with respect to Putin tolerance. Putin has alienated the Czech Republic, for God's sakes, which had a notably pro-Russian president. He is managing to alienate the Bulgarian government and Bulgarian society has some good historical association.
Dan, we've lost your audio, I think.
Oh dear. I heard you. Can you hear me?
Now I can.
All right.
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Okay. Putin's aggression is alienating much of Europe. And I think Europe is moving in a direction where they are going to be more willing to resist Putin's aggression and more willing to support Ukraine, and that without illusions. It will be important for the United States and Europe to come up with a consistent Russia policy. It will never be identical, but it can be consistent and complementary. And that policy, I think, is not hard to discern. It will involve various pillars. I have four. One of them is resisting Putin's aggression. That will be the biggest pillar in the short term. And resisting Russian aggression takes a variety of forms. Through NATO, through support for Ukraine, through resilience, through counter disinformation, through exposing Russian corruption and drawing up the channels of corrupt Russian money flows. It will have an element of cooperation where possible. Where possible. The Biden administration's first step toward Russia was to extend the New START arms control treaty. That was a gesture of cooperation. The Biden administration also introduced sanctions and clearly indicated its willingness to increase these. So Biden administration has both of these pillars. A third pillar will involve attempts to stabilize the relationship. I am not as cynical or as critical as Minister Waszczykowski about Biden's offer of a meeting to Putin, because that meeting was framed in terms of clarity about the way Biden sees Putin. It was not put into a framework of a new reset or illusions about cooperation. It was an offer of dialogue in a context of reality about Putin's aggression. In other words, it was an offer of a meeting on our terms, not Putin's terms. Now, Minister Waszczykowski has a good basis for at least raising the question of the US and Russia doing a deal over the heads of the Ukrainians. President Trump would have been happy to do so had he been allowed to, but there was too much resistance in the United States. I do not think Biden will make that mistake at all. I don't think his team is inclined to make that mistake. Not Tony Blinken, certainly not Victoria Nuland, who is traveling with Blinken to Kyiv. Not Karen Dunford, who's been nominated to be Assistant Secretary of State for Europe. It is a strong team, and a team with immediate and fresh experience with Vladimir Putin's aggression. A fourth pillar of a sustainable relationship with Russia is a long-term investment in Russian society. And that means reaching out to the Russian people, supporting free Russian media, supporting exchanges where we can, investing, in other words, in a better future with a better Russia. No, I am not talking about regime change. I am talking about things, about an updated version of very successful things the United States and the West did during the Cold War, which was to reach out to Soviet society and make a long-term investment in it. With respect to policy toward Ukraine, the United States has made clear we will not accept Russia's annexation of Crimea. Blinken and the State Department made that explicit in a formal statement yesterday. I suspect Tony Blinken will or has already made that clear. And we will not allow Russia to treat Ukraine as if it doesn't exist or as if it is Putin's and Kremlin property. That means a long-term effort to work with Ukraine. At the same time, a second element of US policy toward Ukraine is going to be to push Ukraine to reform itself from within, to build a nation which is both democratic, which Ukraine arguably already is, but also respects the rule of law, which Ukraine has not yet done, not to sufficient detail, not to sufficient extent. Ukraine basically needs to follow the successful path of Poland and the Baltic states a generation ago. And I know this from working on the issues in the early 1990s. Poland's success in the early 1990s meant that when Poland started pushing for NATO and EU membership in the mid-1990s, it started even earlier, but the big drive came in the mid-1990s. And when it did so, it had enormous political capital because it was already seen as a success story. That political capital that Poles from right to left built for themselves through their success at democratic free market transformation at home, that political capital they could then invest in their drive to join the institutions of an undivided West. And I mention this because I was involved in the policy from the US side, but I always said at the time and after that, that Poland and other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, but particularly Poland and the Baltic states later, gave me the political capital with which to work because they were doing their work at home. My point is perfectly obvious. Ukraine has the ability to generate similar political capital for itself, and it needs to do so through a domestic transformation. And we in the West need to help. We need to help Ukraine deal with the external aggression from Putin, which has an element of both military pressure and internal subversion. But we also need to push Ukraine to push through its reforms, its transformational reforms. And I suspect that this is something that the Biden administration, a message the Biden administration is conveying today in Kyiv. That's not private knowledge, but I think my guess is right. So this is an important day. I see that Europe is getting its act together with respect to Russia. I realize I may sound like a naive American, but I'm trying to look at the hopeful side of things. And I think that Putin has, in the Soviet era, he could be accused of voluntaristic adventurism by his behavior recently, and by the fact that he received significant pushback in his latest threats against Ukraine from the United States, but also from Chancellor Merkel in Germany. So I think we are in a position of a coalescing, decent Western policy toward Putin and the potential of a coherent, supportive policy of the West for Ukraine. And as for the German elections and the Greens, I can only applaud the consistent and principled record of the Green Party. And I hope that those policy elements find their way into the positions of the next German government, one way or another. So, dużo dziękuję.
Thank you. That's a great transition yet again. First, Minister Waszczykowski handing over to Ambassador Fried, and now by raising the issue of Ukraine's internal development, we have the benefit of parliamentarians and politicians and government officials who've had a deep interaction with Ukraine over the course of many years. And so I think I'd like to engage you a little bit in your understanding, and maybe to discuss how how your colleagues understand in government and in parliament the degree to which Ukraine is resilient, the degree to which Ukraine is divided internally, the degree to which it has the possibility of achieving what Dan has set out as an aim of ridding itself of this yoke of corruption, all of those kinds of issues. And but I want to just kind of leave one thought before we move down the path of fighting oligarchy and fighting corruption, and that is that in my view, the process of a transition in the fight against corruption and the fight against oligarchy has to be done carefully, so that there are other levers of influence and power in society. The oligarchic influences are too strong, but we saw how when Mr. Putin moved against only one oligarch, all the other oligarchs went into line. And the real question is, how can the transition that tames oligarchy in Ukraine, that deals with their role in corruption, be done in such a way that there is also a presence not only for civil society and of the influence of Western diplomacy and of, I would say, the Maidan on Ukrainian leaders, but also the influence of business on the country's leaders as a constraint on an excessive concentrations of power. And I'll start with Madam von Cramon. I think your interactions with Ukraine and interests in its democratic development make you an ideal speaker to continue the discussion.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very broad field of activity if you dig a little bit deeper into these domestic issues, which also have an external dimension. While if Ukraine does not become a consolidated democracy, there's no chance for a map for NATO side. So I was asked before by one of the members how we Greens see the members' action plan from the NATO side. I'm personally very much in favor, but I see there's a long way to go. And it's not just the military reforms, it's about consolidating their own democracy at home. And from that perspective, you said that the executive is pretty, or rather split. I mean, we have seen so many exchanges of ministers and positions the last weeks and months. We have seen many faces coming in and out, reshuffling of different positions in the government. And we see also that the interest-dominated or parts of the interest-dominated group of Zelensky makes this ruling of the country not just easier. I think for many of us who observe Ukraine, that was obvious from the very beginning after the vote or the election in 2019 was over. But nevertheless, Zelensky now, and therefore I'm very grateful for Biden's interference and for the pressure coming mainly from US. Zelensky now feels the pressure coming from the international community. While for the last 4 years, it was definitely very, very difficult to find a transatlantic, let's say, joint approach or common approach to many of these domestic reform issues. And it was not so easy to push the government for this or the other direction. And now I see, and today after the visit, maybe we will see even more new initiatives from the Zelensky government and from the presidential administration. I'm still very much concerned about some figures in his team, especially Andrei Yermak, who has obviously close ties into Russia and into some of their also security service circles. And that's, for me, it's a very dubious figure, and it's very difficult how we're going to deal with those people who are so close and who are actually one of the major decision makers in the Zelensky team. Therefore, I thought it was a very courageous decision from the Zelensky side, before even informing Andriy Yermak to close down the 3 Medvedchuk channels. I think that was a good, very good and a tough decision. And it was helpful that the US administration helped with this. When it came to, let's say, the crucial and the core domestic reforms, we talk about judiciary, we talk about also, I would call it health reform, and some other reforms. We see always 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Energy security is also something where I would, let's say, see a more coherent position from the European Union. We have mentioned the Nord Stream 2 project, which hopefully we can stop after September, and we will make sure that this pipeline will be never used for any gas transfer or delivering. But of course, this is still to be negotiated. Also, in that respect, the Biden administration is of big help. I think this is clear. There is a big interest, a joint interest, not to use this pipeline, but also we have to push the Ukrainian government into more alternative, into renewables. The European Green Deal, I think some of the politicians, decision makers have internalized what it means, but it's not sufficient. So when we want to phase out of Russian gas, of coal, of oil, and at some point also of nuclear, not now, that's for sure not the first priority, but nevertheless, we have to invest massively, and it needs also foreign direct investment. And with the last decisions in the radar, that only created a lot of insecurities, and all the investment which were planned, mainly also on hydropower, on other projects, were stopped, and that came from the oligarch interest from Kolomoisky's group and others. So there is a lot to do from the European side. We have to find the right alliance. We have to find the right groups to protect, but we have to also make sure that the draft laws, especially in energy and on the judiciary side, are the ones who can end up in more, let's say, an economical, stable framework. So we have really a more environmentally an attractive environment, and a business environment, which is set up to increase the right companies, which would encourage small and medium enterprises, innovative technology or high technology companies being settled. And also then we can work with European funds from Horizon, some cooperation. Mr. Kubilius does work on research and science issues. I think there's a big field which we have not really used when it came to Ukraine. I would see this also as part of the post-COVID program, which could be much more used from the Ukrainian side if we had proper people in place in the ministries, in agencies, and also in the presidential administration. So this is mainly up to Ukraine to put some proposals on the table and to really use our money, the European recovery funds, Horizon, and other money from special support for Ukraine for their particular purposes.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Prime Minister Kubilius with a little bit of continue the discussion that has been launched in terms of reform and resilience, but also add another issue. You come from a country where national identity is pretty clear-cut. You may have a small group of dissenters, but pretty much everyone understands there is a unified sense of patriotism. There are no language issues and so on. How do you assess the progress Ukraine is making towards national unity? And to what extent do you think this is a sort of the devil's playground for Putin? How powerful is that devil's playground these days? And what kind of mechanism, and how widely is this problem, how is this problem perceived by, not just by you as a person who understands Ukraine more deeply, but by your European colleagues?
Well, thanks a lot for this question. Maybe I will try to put it into some kind of broader, picture. First of all, really, if we are looking into Ukraine, it's really amazing country. It also has a lot of typical post-Soviet, features, which is pretty natural and which started real reforms only after the last Maidan, after the Dignity Revolution. That is the difference. If we started back in 1990, so Ukraine started just in 2014. I always had a joke that, if you want to understand in the post-Soviet, area, is the country really doing reforms, despite what the leaders are speaking? Look when the Lenin monuments were removed in the country. That is a feature, and that is what had happened in Ukraine only after the last Maidan. So that is one thing. Second, in some way, I can say, answering to your question on identity, that is nothing new, but in some way we need to thank Mr. Putin for, really creating a pro-Western identity of Ukraine, which came again with a lot of, tragedies, blood and so on, but fighting for European direction, for Ukrainian identity. That is what helped, now nation to have, in majority, clear identity. Okay, of course, there is an opposition, pro-Russian opposition, so-called opposition bloc. But exactly today I saw on Europejska Pravda, on Union, I don't know which website I read, the last opinion polls, which were showing that Zelensky party would win 28%. Second is this, opposition bloc 19, then Poroshenko 18. Yulia Tymoshenko 11, and then some smaller groups, some smaller parties. So which means that really, more or less not pro-European parties, pro-Russian parties have only about 20%, at least what opinion polls are showing. So that is not a bad numbers. Second point, really, of course, Ukraine needs to make reforms. It needs to consolidate its political will on reforms. We can speak a lot about, how to cut oligarch influence, how to bring rule of law, and things like that. Not everything is very easy to do, but the biggest problem, I think, especially when we Europeans are talking towards Ukrainians, about what kind of reforms they need to do, we are forgetting, at least a little bit our own responsibility. What kind of reforms we need to do inside of EU in order really for Ukraine to speed up Ukrainian integration. Because at least in my opinion, there are any example of single country after Second World War, after Soviet Union collapse, which would manage to make reforms and to establish stable and successful democracy in post-totalitarian, post-communist country without really integration towards EU. Ambassador Dan Fried, mentioned our experience, Baltics and Poland, like good examples. But we should not forget that from 1993, with Copenhagen criteria announced by EU Council at that time, we saw very clearly perspectives that we shall be able to join EU. And then, step by step, after 10 years, after 1993, we were, at the gates of EU. And that was motivation for us to keep reforms. So this very practical, instrument, what we call, carrot and stick, That is what is working, at least in our example. I can tell you, I was in politics. I was prime minister at that time, and I saw very much, you couldn't believe, step aside from direction towards EU at that time, domestically would kill you as politician, immediately. That was how it was working. Now, what I'm telling why I'm not satisfied with, well, Vitold Vasccikovsky spoke about, EU inability to bring security in a proper way towards Ukraine. I am dissatisfied very much with EU inability to bring some kind of integration perspective. Look, we asked, and we got very interesting report from very prominent think tank here in Brussels, CEPS, Center of European Policy Studies. They compared, Eastern Partnership countries, associated countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, with Western Balkan countries, which are, Western Balkan countries. They have membership perspective. They are candidates towards EU, and the comparison, according to all the different data, was showing was bringing very simple conclusion. There is no big difference in between of Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, and Western Balkan countries. But the difference is in EU attitude. Western Balkan countries have membership perspective. Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova still do not have membership perspective. The question is why? Well, I can guess, that again, there is some countries, some capitals which are thinking that it can provoke Putin and so on. From my point of view, exactly it would be opposite. Bringing, I'm not talking now about immediate, membership or whatever, but giving clear perspective. In our case, answering very simple question, where we imagine Ukraine should be, for example, in 2030. Like Europeans, we need to have very simple answer. What we expect from Ukraine, and if we want really Ukraine to become successful and going with integration, we need to show them what is the way. So that is why we started to discuss also, since really for you it would be difficult for time being to speak about enlargement and membership, but there is a very interesting formula which was brought back in 2003 by Romano Prodi. Who said, let's promise to all the neighbors everything but institutions. All the benefits of real, membership, like integration into single market, access to EU funds, and so on and so on. But for time being, maybe, till EU will resolve its own, domestic internal problems with decision making and so on, which are huge. That is why we are going into this, conference on the future of Europe. Till then, maybe not to promise, presence in institutions, presence in decision making, but at least let's give any, some clear path for Ukraine, where Ukraine needs to go, what it can achieve during the next 10 years, and that could be really that motivation, that carrot, and then we can use, painful stick if that will not, if Ukraine would make any kind of mistakes. That is how it works in our region. That is what we can see again from Ukrainian example. How much Ukraine, achieved when they were trying to get the association agreement, how much they achieved and how much they did when he was with a free, agreement promised. Let's go in that direction. Let's not be afraid, And that is exactly what, again, I'm saying, that should be also our part of our policy towards Russia. Success of Ukraine is the best instrument really to try, at least to assist changes in Russia itself.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Minister Waszczykowski and to ask on the question of resilience, the question of diplomatic resilience, but also the effectiveness over the last year and a half, 2 years of the Zelensky team and of President Zelensky, who has made, in his view, I would say, earnest efforts to try to open a dialogue with Putin to reduce the, I would say, the rhetoric, to sometimes not speak in ways that he believes may be provocative. To what extent do you think that was a successful policy? To what extent is it immaterial? And to what extent is he successfully engaging Europe by virtue of the kind of diplomacy he's pursued with Russia? Is that helpful, harmful, or meaningless, so to speak?
No, I think it's partially successful. He is partially successful, but would be quite easy from my point of view as a Polish politician to criticize Ukraine for the lack of reforms or lacking behind with reforms. And I appreciate what Dan Friend mentioned about Poland in the beginning of 1990s, the mid of 1990s, but that was unique situation for us. First of all, we were all united in Poland to come back to the West. There was no discussion about some kind of a third world, middle way to create something new. No, it was a clear decision to join NATO, join European Union. And we, of course, adopted something we can call a cold Turkey approach at the beginning of 1990s, very costly reforms, but because it was supported by the whole society. The second, we got a clear perspective of membership in NATO and European Union. It was the question of time, but there was no question of if. It was just a question when, a little bit question how. There is no such a perspective as Mr. Kubilius just rightly mentioned for the Ukraine. And the third aspect, we were dealing at that time, 1990s, with a very weak Russia. It was Russia of not quite sober Yeltsin, if we all remember. So that was a little bit easier. And now we have Putin. We don't have a clear perspective in European Union for Ukrainians. So that's the problem. We have to create this perspective. Politicians, as also Mr. Kubilius mentions, they need the stick, but they need also the carrots. The carrots for themselves, they have to be successful, and they need the carrots for the society to support them in this very costly reforms. So we have to create this situation for Ukraine, and as I mentioned, at least let's try to open some programs of European Union for the Ukrainians. Let's bring them closer to some agencies, agendas of the European Union. So these are the problems of Mr. Zelensky. He cannot say openly to the society that if we implement this program of reforms, if we adopt this acquis communautaire, we will join European Union. No, there is no such promise. And I remember that in Poland, we evaluated in 1990s that implementation of just a legal basis of the membership, it was about 6% of GDP. So regardless of other transformation, just adoption of this implementation of the legal basis of the acquis communautaire. So it's very costly. So without these promises, of course, Zelensky has no chance to convince the society to work harder, to concentrate, to focus on reforms. He has to spend about 6 to 8% of the GDP yearly for security, to defend itself from Russia escalation of further aggression. So there is another problem. He has to deal with, I would say, not very efficient formats to deal with Russia: Normandy formula and Minsk formula. As I mentioned in my first intervention, I don't think that the countries like Germany and France, they want to solve the conflict. They just want to freeze the conflict and come back to the business as usual with Russia. So I think he doesn't, I mean, Zelensky doesn't have the honest brokers on the western part of the continent. So I think that surprisingly, he's doing quite well, still having about 25% of support. That's not bad. That's not bad. He promised a lot, of course, and he cannot deliver everything, but he's doing quite well. That's why we're supposed to use this opportunity and help him further, not to criticize and reinvent the wheel that finally first. Let's be honest. In many cases in Western Europe, many of our colleagues, of our friends, members of the European Union, they do not fulfill the requirements of the membership right now. In case of economic situation, in case of other political aspects. So how we can push Ukraine to be the better than us, than ourselves, you know? It's like asking to be more papist than the Pope in Rome. You know, that's a Polish mention, the Polish saying. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I want to remind the audience we have only about 15 minutes or so to go. If you have any questions, you can pose them in chat mode, and I will adapt one of the questions and turn it to Dan Fried, because again, we've already invoked the issues of security and NATO and so on. And the question is there anything to expect from the Biden administration in terms of reopening the issue of Ukraine in NATO, or of urging the Europeans to open their doors? Or is there too much realpolitik now in Washington, and the idea that neither France nor at least Germany's current political configurations cannot be convinced on either of those important processes?
I was at the Bucharest NATO summit in April 2008, when we fought up to the last minute and in the leaders' meeting room to get a map for Ukraine and Georgia, and we failed. What we got was actually a statement that the ultimate goal for Georgia and Ukraine was NATO membership. That's what the leaders agreed. That was Angela Merkel working with the Poles, the Baltic states, Condi Rice, you know, huddling. If we push for a map now, we'll lose. Okay, I'm being brutal, but that's a fact. However, the challenge that Minister Waszczykowski raised and that Prime Minister Kubilius mentioned of a clear perspective for Ukraine of what the end state is important. If we push for map now, we'll lose. I don't think the European Union is ready to explicitly promise membership, but we can't leave Ukraine hanging as if we expect them to be in a gray zone, because that is an invitation for Putin. How do you bridge this gap? It seems to me we need to be clear about Ukraine's ultimate destination as a member of an undivided Europe and an undivided Euro-Atlantic community. We have to be clear about the ultimate end state, and be clear that to some degree, Ukraine can be the author of its own fate, but they need our support. We cannot throw everything on them. We need to be clear about the end state, and then we work at the details, piece by piece. That's easier said than done. Look, I have vivid memories of the early 90s, and I can assure Minister Waszczykowski that in the most difficult periods of Poland's transformation, say 91, 92, 93, Washington was nowhere ready at all to acknowledge what Poland's ultimate destination would be. I mean, I was fighting those fights. When the Clinton administration started wrestling with this issue, Poland was already seen as a success. They had done it. what was the roughest year in Poland's transformation? I don't know, maybe 1992, right? You can argue it, but I would say 1992 was the toughest year. They didn't have a perspective, but, and Minister Waszczykowski is absolutely right. They had a national consensus. They had a national consensus. They also had a more benign Russia. Absolutely true. So where's Ukraine? It doesn't have quite the national consensus that Poland did in the early days, but it's getting one. Thanks to Vladimir Putin, whose position is basically that the Ukrainian people doesn't exist, except maybe they're fascists. I mean, it's a disgusting position. And I think I see, as an outsider, Ukrainian opinion consolidating in a pro-European direction. Secondly, we have a worse, absolutely a stronger Russia and a more aggressive Russia. On the other hand, Ukraine has one advantage that Poland and the Baltic states didn't have in the early 90s. In the early 90s, most people in the West and some Poles thought you can never build democracy and a free market economy on the ruins of communism. It's impossible. Because it had never been done. It had never even been contemplated. The Ukrainians know it is possible. It's not easy. God knows, Poland, Slovakia, the Baltic states, they got tons of problems. But look where they are. Look where they are. Ukraine knows it is possible. So we all have our challenges. Yeah, we can't offer Ukraine the same kind of explicit deal that we offered Poland a generation ago. But there's a lot we can do. We need to do our part. Ukraine needs to do its part. Look, I have the bias of a former policymaker, where you're supposed to take a miserable situation and not revel in the misery, but figure out what you are going to do to achieve the results you want. And I think we can get there.
Thank you. We have an audience question that asks, why doesn't the West take specific affirmative measures that will require Putin to turn inward? And I want to refer to an article that Dan and I wrote for Foreign Policy this week, which makes the case that incremental sanctions are having an effect on Putin. But if you look at them from the perspective of the long term, they have a dramatic effect on the size and scale of the Russian economy. In the last 7 years, the Russian economy, according to our colleague Andrius has grown 0.3% annually, while the OECD countries have grown at about 2.3% annually. If Russia falls behind and Russia has 1.5% less growth than it would otherwise in the absence of sanctions, in 20 years it will be about 35 to 40% a smaller economy than it is otherwise. If that rate could be pushed down to 2.5% through the effect of sanctions and perhaps energy technological changes and the move towards green energy and less dependence on the kinds of resources that Russia has, it could mean that Russia will be 70% to 80% smaller 20 years from now. So from the strategic point of view, a smaller Russia will have less ability to project power. And I wanted to kind of introduce this discussion because we did talk a little bit about sanctions. Sanctions often seem to be a tough thing for, well, they're easy for parliamentarians to vote on, but often tough for governments to implement. What are your thoughts about the possibility of adding this dimension of containment, this economic dimension of containment, not simply to satisfy, legitimately to satisfy our moral anger or to react to specific Russian events, but as an overall kind of strategic approach to have a less powerful Russia and to get the Russian elite to understand that if it wants to grow, it has to reach an accommodation with the West. And I'll ask Madame von Cramon if she is willing to take this on, and our other speakers, but briefly, because we're in the last hurdles of our 90-minute race.
It can be very briefly, and many people who have followed the policy of the Greens can confirm, hopefully, that we have, not just for this reason, but also for this reason, for the strategical reason, try to enforce the independence of Russian gas, of all Russian fossil fuels, to increase the independence as much as we can, because this would ruin the business model of the state kleptocracy, of Putin's alliance in the Kremlin. Most of his fundaments are based on the sale of fossil fuels such as gas, uranium, oil, and others. If we can make sure that we put our money, our investment into renewables and others, and can reduce our energy consumption significantly, and that's why Putin fights the Greens as well, not just because of our tougher stand against his foreign policy, but also that, of course, we would like to see a complete different energy policy. I know this is not in line with everyone here on the panel, but at least it is very coherent when it comes to a Russia strategy. And also, I would be in favor of taking another stick when it comes to the SWIFT sanction. And I would go, I mean, especially now the threat with the military, the last so-called maneuver, which they will continue, and they will start again at the end of this year with a new separate maneuver. I would just start, and also the support for Belarus and all the other little bits and pieces here and there, and the street of Kerch, what we have seen there, cut them off of SWIFT for 6 months and see how much they will would be cooperate with the West, as you have said. I would go for much tougher ways of handling these economical ties, and really would like to see a commitment whether they are ready to cooperate with international partners and whether they would like to play after international rules or not. I think the SWIFT agreement or SWIFT treaty could be an easy, let's say, ground to test this commitment from the Russian side.
Thank you. And without being partisan in terms of Germany's political future, at the very least, we have the expectation of some potential for some of these views to be a part of the discussion of policy going forward if the German people vote the way that at least current polls suggest. We are close to the end, so I won't ask any further specific questions, but just ask Prime Minister Kubilius for a couple of minutes of concluding remarks, and similarly Mr. Waszczykowski. I will not ask Dan Fried because he gave such a peroration that it seemed like the conclusion of our meeting, and ask all of you to stay on because we're going to do a screenshot before we go offline of all the participants, but please wait for that. So Minister Waszczykowski, last thoughts to bring us to Prime Minister Kubilius to bring us to our conclusion.
Well, really, thanks a lot, first of all, for this very interesting conversation. Second, despite the fact that I am from EPP family, where German CDU is part of that family, I can just agree with Viola from Cramon, you know, and to hope that really things can be going in that way. Because I absolutely agree that when we're talking about policy towards Russia, we need to see very clearly. Personal sanctions are interesting, but they are not making big impact. So-called Ukrainian sanctions, which were introduced, economical sanctions, which were introduced after occupation of Crimea, they are painful. But the biggest and the largest issue really is, how to cut EU dependency on Russian gas. And that is, much larger topic than only, Nord Stream 2, which again, I am against very much, but we should not, concentrate only on Nord Stream 2. Unfortunately, what I see in the numbers, since Norwegian gas and North Sea gas is going to be, it's coming to the end. EU dependency on Russian gas can increase if we shall not start really to be serious about how to cut that dependency. Because as I said, Norwegian gas is going to the end. Russian gas and the resources of Russian gas can increase because of climate change, because they are getting more access towards Arctic and some all new fields. So that is where our priority should be. Very, very, very tough and radical priority. Really, Green Deal here is one of the benefits which we can try to implement, and where we need to look for totally new, new alternatives. For time being, maybe LNG terminals, but in looking into the future, we need to look into new technologies and whatever, green hydrogen or things like that should be our priority. And we need to discuss those issues in a very radical way here in the European Parliament, and I hope that we shall come to that. And maybe decision of Kremlin to punish President of European Parliament Sassoli recently shows that Putin started to understand that European Parliament is not just and how to say body of empty statements. Some things we can do in the parliament also.
Thank you very much, Minister Waszczykowski. 2 minutes of concluding remarks, please.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure this is a concluding remark, but final word from Poland, from Warsaw. If you ask in Warsaw about our position, our approach, our attitude toward Russia, the answer will be also common for all Poles. The smaller, the weaker, the better. The smaller Russia, the weaker Russia, the better. I don't want to say that Americans are naive, as Dan Friend mentioned. I would say I'm less optimistic. I do not believe that Russia will follow our path of transformation. We were naive in 1990s during the Yeltsin time, and then later during the Medvedev time, the so-called technocrat, that we were hoping that sooner or later Russia will follow our transformation. It didn't happen. It did not happen. And I'm not naive also that even if we get rid of Putin and Mr. Navalny will be the president of Russia, Russia will be only a little bit less imperialistic and less nationalistic, but will be still the country which is going to fight for the position. We cannot satisfy them. We offer them almost everything. They are part of Security Council of United Nations. They are part of G7, G8. They are part of any regional structure to deal with Iran, Palestine, Israel, North Korea. European Union offered them unique privileges. NATO offered them unique privileges. They are rejecting everything. They are rejecting everything. So what else we can give them to satisfy them? Nothing. We have to start opposite policy to punish them and to force them to respect, to obey international law, international standards. And we have to force not only Putin, but part of the society which is supporting him to respect us like the other countries.
Thank you all. Before we leave, I'd like all of us, including our audience, to stay on. Dr. Maria Prešlak is going to join us for concluding remarks and our screenshot of every participant. So we're going to ask everybody to click on your video, not your audio, because that will be very loud and we will take a shot. But I want to just express my own gratitude for being in the company, not of politicians, but of statesmen and stateswomen, people who think broadly, people who have you know, a deep intellectual command of strategic issues and a deep knowledge of Ukraine. It's an honor to be in your company and to have had this discussion. And I'm very grateful to the Ukrainian Free University, which is true to its century of roots of discussion outside of the territory of Ukraine. And I want to turn to Dr. Maria Prishvak to send us off. Again, thank you very much.
Very briefly, I wanted to just join our moderator, Adrian Karatnitsky, in thanking all our distinguished panelists for this truly insightful and illuminating discussion. And I would like to thank our audience for joining us and to invite them to join us for the next event. Thank you to all, and all the best. And now we will take the screenshot.